Welcome to the Art of the Americas is the topic for this week, and that should, I think, have a lot of interest in particular personal or special relevance for a lot of people because in the mini bios, I notice how many people's either origins or birthplace was from countries in this hemisphere outside the United States. Obviously we're talking about Central America and Mexico, but in this course we also include South America. So in fact, the two main countries, we'll get to the introductory comments in a few minutes. I have a couple of announcements to make. And that's important, of course, for the remainder of this semester, how things are going to, not every week by week, that's on the syllabus, but just some broad overall informational announcements I'll make in a couple of minutes. But anyway, today we're going to cover mostly Mexico, and we may get, well, actually, no, we should get to Peru as well. And so I'll give you some overview of, those two countries' current status. And, I've been doing that with China, India, Japan, world art, in other words, where the information, is relevant because those countries are very much obviously part in participants in world events, world cultures today. And many of you have origins from those cultures. I speak un poquito español. Mi español no es muy bueno. Es así. Es bastante para un turista. I'm able to get by when I've traveled in Latin American countries with the help usually of a person I'm traveling with who's bilingual, but not always, sometimes on my own. But of course, becoming bilingual or trilingual or multilingual is more and more of a big advantage in the modern world. So I think it's one of those things that I believe it's still required, isn't it, to take a foreign language before you finish high school in California, at least a public high school. So I think so. And it used to be at the university level. So I studied two languages at UC Berkeley, Spanish for at least 2 years and German. In my first trip to Europe, I used both languages quite regularly. And then since then, mostly Spanish and Cuban Spanish, which some people don't even consider. It's very different than the rest of Latin American versions of Spanish, and way different than Spanish, that is in the home country of Spain, where they speak the king Spanish, right? If there is such a thing. I mean, there isn't a king of Spain anymore per se, but the point is there's a older version of the language in Europe that everyone who speaks Spanish usually understands each other, but there are some big differences. All right, my announcements are the following. I have sent back the grades for your midterms to everybody that I got a midterm from, and I've noticed a couple of people, more than one, who when I gave the test, this crossed my mind. It's the first time this has happened. Well, at least in a while since the doing Zoom class, maybe the first time I did Zoom, but in the last 3 years, that 32 people logged on to the test. I think one person logged out early. So that would mean 31 people completed the time, at least. Whether they were doing the questions and answering them during that time, I don't know. But I only got 26 exams returned to me. So that's what, 5 people that were there present during the real-time exam for the midterm, and I never got their midterm. So I can't grade something I didn't get. So any individual, one or two of you already have contacted me. All I can say is if you have proof that you must have sent it to either one or two things, to the wrong email address, that happens, or something happened that would be your end, the send, not you, but the sender, your server, and it could have gotten filtered out, but I don't see why it would go to spam. I already had everyone's email address from the mini bios. But in any case, I've checked, and if I don't have it, there are only 2 options for the midterm until about now at this late date. To be fair to those who turned it in on time, of course, which is if you have proof that you emailed it to me by the deadline. I was a little flexible. A couple of people emailed me their midterm at like 12:20. I wasn't going to not accept those. But, the next day, 12 hours later, that's an unfair advantage for anyone who took that extra time over everyone else, the vast majority who turned them in by the deadline. Yeah, deadlines have to mean something. So if you have proof that you sent it in to somehow it didn't get to me, whatever the reason is not what's important, it should be obvious. It should be in your email trail, I guess it's called, records, and you could forward it to me, and then I will count it if it was originally sent before the deadline, or by about midnight on the day of the test. As far as the papers go, there is no more points off if I didn't get a paper from you. And again, if you think you sent it to me, or you say you sent it to me, I didn't see it. That isn't very common, but it does happen for whatever reason. That would be accepted without any question, and it wouldn't be any extra points off if it was done before the paper deadline. If it was after the deadline, it would be 10 points off, just like everyone else's if they're late. It doesn't go up. So if and again, there are still people I know who haven't written, or at least a couple, I assume 3 or 4 maybe, their papers. It's not the end of the world, but you don't want to wait too much longer. Try to get them in this week would be good, so that I can get them back to you by the weekend, I would think, or certainly early within a week. Late papers just have 10 points off, and it doesn't go up after that. I've been mentioning this since the first week of class. That's my late policy. It's fairly flexible, if not lenient. But on test, it's a different story, because obviously if someone waited for a day or two and then, shows me that they sent it somewhere else, but now they're resending it and it isn't the same day that it was due, then how do I know they didn't take the extra time to work on it? And that's not fair to the other students. So I can't guarantee that I will accept any test this late, but if you have proof that you did send it to me completed as of the midnight on the day of test, then I would accept it, of course. Okay, so that's some people I've already emailed about that, but if you're one of those people, that 5 or so people, maybe it was 6 even, right? 31 or 32 were signed in, but 1 person dropped out of the test. I thought maybe they dropped out of the class, but I haven't had any drops from the class, and that's good this late in the semester. It just means that you need to go back and check your email records if you're certain you had sent it, either one of the 2 things, but especially with the midterm, right away. And then I'll get back to you once I see the evidence to confirm if I can accept it. Okay, hope that's clear. Yeah. All right, let's see now. Do we have anybody else here now just joining? All right, so here are a couple more announcements. We don't have another assignment until early November. In fact, let's take a look. You see, if you have the syllabus in front of you, right? The next assignment, written assignment, besides reading each chapter, that's your ongoing assignment for each week's lecture. Before that lecture, that Monday lecture. And of course, that's all on your syllabus. But then we are going to have a second midterm, which I will describe to you as to how to take it by the end of this month, because the second midterm is November 9th. So it's a whole month from now. So use the time wisely. I would recommend some extra credit. By the way, on the tests, nobody failed the midterm. Those I've received, which I assume was right, those who were turned in on time. And even those that didn't get, most people got an A or a B. That's above average. Those are good grades. But even if you didn't, remember, extra credit options are still out there. Not to quote from the X-Files. The truth is that out there, but your options are still out there. And you can still make up to 60 points extra credit. And I don't think anyone's, let's just double check. I'm not going to read anyone's totals, but on my roster, I only have a handful of people doing extra credit so far. I think it's 3, and none of them have done more than 30. So that's only half. So you all still have options for extra credit. Here, let me all right, we didn't start the slides yet. I was just talking about some announcements. About to finish up with that, and we'll get to the this week's topic of art in the Americas in just a couple minutes. But first, to finish up on that, to me, that's a good sign that the vast majority of tests were A's and B's, and that nobody failed the exam. This isn't true of all my classes, either in person or online, frankly. So of course it was an open book test, but still you had a time frame you had to work. So that's congratulations in general. And if you didn't get an A or B, you can still raise your grade, of course, to that level for that portion of this course. We're halfway through, right? In terms of grading, you've had a paper and a midterm, and then there'll be a second midterm and a final, and they all have equal weight. Remember, 100 points each. So that means we're now up through the first 200 points of possible assigned grade points, not counting extra credit. And that's why you can see how the extra credit options really can make a huge difference. And almost everybody who exercises those options and wasn't earning an A, but was getting a C, C plus or B, has always raised their grade at least to the one letter grade higher, if not to an A. And remember, in this college, at least most JCs, I think we don't give pluses and minuses for final course grades. So if you got 90%, you got an A, and that's what your transcript would reflect, of course. Okay, so that's one thing. And then the other is I will be out of town on the weekend. Ironically, it's before Halloween, has nothing to do with that fact. Used to be when I was teaching, my daughter was little and I had in-person classes every Monday, and Halloween would occasionally fall on a Monday. I'd tell my students, you guys go out and do your thing, trick or treat, whatever party. I need to be with my daughter, but that isn't the case here. It's family business I have to take care of down in LA. I have quite a few family members, in-laws, relatives, nephews, and there's some things we have to deal with. And that's the only weekend that works for all those things. So I will be gone on Monday. I'll be driving back with my family from Los Angeles, and I won't be checking my email on, that's actually the day of Halloween. So what am I going to do about the lecture for that day? Well, let's look ahead. I've already given a lot of thought. It's not going to impact your ability, your opportunities to learn, because this is such an important set of slides coming up when we get to painting, which for many people is what they think all of art is, just painting, right? But it is, of course, what's the most well-known form of visual arts. That date we have scheduled, I'm taking a look at it, and I've already decided what I'm going to do. Impressionism. Well, that's a pretty important topic. And many of you know from studying, and also your own in your many bios, you may have told me you're a talented artist already, and you've probably done some impressionist exercises in that style of painting. It's a revolutionary movement that began sort of, you could say, the era of modern painting, or some would say modern art, because it overlapped from painting into photography and sculpture too. So I'm not going to cut down, reduce, let alone cut out the slides that we were going to cover for that Monday, which would be the first half of, if you look at your syllabus, week 12, right? I'm going to record that lecture and give you all the same information I would have and post it on YouTube before I leave town, probably by that Friday. So along with that previous weeks, the last week of October's lectures that I always post by Friday, I also will post a lecture about the early Impressionists. And then we'll finish with Impressionists. I'll be back, of course. The next class will be Wednesday the 2nd. Okay, is everybody clear on that? And I'll repeat that announcement, send you an email. So you won't be in any way impacted by my absence, but things happen, life happens, and families have to take care of stuff. So I'll be gone for that whole weekend, and I don't think I'll be able to check my email much. I might be able to, but I can't guarantee it, because I'll be commuting, can't do it then, back and forth 450 miles, right, each direction, and then of course meeting with family members down in Southern California and going back. And so I can't guarantee I get back to you until Tuesday the 1st. If you send me an email during the weekend before or the day of Halloween, because I will be back late that evening. Okay. All right. Any questions about extra credit or anything I've just mentioned? So we can now segue to the slides and the topic for this week, which of course is Art of the Americas. Anybody have any questions that they have about what I've just talked, any of the things I've just mentioned? I think we might end slightly earlier than usual on both days. It depends on how many questions you guys have. The number of slides is slightly less, as is the case with the chapters in Stockstead on those subjects. Does not in any way mean those topics aren't equally important. And I've traveled all over Mexico and Cuba, and briefly to Guatemala. I haven't been south of Central America. So some of you, I think, have been to South America, but I have some very good friends, fellow teachers who come back from Peru, especially Machu Picchu. We're going to see that. We might get that far today. Actually, I think we might. But in case we are going to cover it this week. One of the most amazing places on earth. One of the two Inca capitals. They had more than one, but that was their mountain site. Some of you know it's been in films, documentaries, all kinds of books. It's an incredible place. We'll talk about all those things, but let's go ahead and get started with the overview. You don't have to take notes, remember, on this part, but if I don't give you context, I think it makes it less clear how these cultures are relevant to us today if you haven't already studied them or are from that culture or been to those places. So we're looking at areas south of the United States, is a broad way to look at it. We're looking at Central and South America. As some of you may know, some people say, instead of los Estados Unidos, they'll say Norteamericanos. Okay, yes, but even that's not correct. Americans, US citizens, okay, calling themselves that, because Mexico and Central America are in the same continent as we are. It's all North America, north of the Isthmus of Panama, right? If you haven't looked at a map, you might want to glance at one just for your own interest. You don't need to for this class. And then there's a whole separate continent. It's huge, South America. So the majority of those people in all those countries, from Mexico all the way south to the tip of Chile, speak Espanol, of course. But we know there are multiple languages in Latin America, and that would include, of course, Portuguese in Brazil, which is now, I think, the fourth most populous country in the world. I'm pretty sure that's right. Well, it might be fifth after Indonesia, but I mean, it's over 200 million people and growing rapidly. So they speak Portuguese because they were once a colony of Portugal. All the rest of South America pretty much speaks Spanish, and Central America, but the Caribbean's a different story. The Caribbean, including Cuba, Haiti, Dominican Republic, a lot of other island nations. There are multiple languages. Of course, Spanish is a major one, but there's also French and Dutch. There were some Dutch colonies. English, of course, many of those colonies were, those islands were made into English colonies. And even Creole, and then also native dialects. So there's quite a few different languages spoken in the Caribbean. But we're going to concentrate in this course, as we have limited time, on Mexico and Peru. So let's start with Mexico. Mexico is one of the few countries in the world with over 100 million people. There are about a dozen, well, maybe it's 15 by now, including Egypt and Vietnam just across that barrier. The population of Vietnam just passed 100 million, but Mexico's been in that club, if you want to say, that rare group of nations with that many people for decades. There are about 130 million. Now, last time I checked, it's probably a little over that. It's a good size, right, population. And of course, they have thousands of years of history. So I'll say this, as I said it before, I think when we were talking about the oldest urban civilizations, what are they? I'll just say outright that Central America, that is the some people used to use this word, is still be used by some historians, pre-Columbian or pre-colonial indigenous populations, are one of the 5 oldest urban civilizations in the world. Mostly we're thinking of the Mayan, what we're going to cover is the Mayan and the Aztec cultures. And that would be where Mexico and Central America, those nations are today. One of the 5 oldest urban civilizations on Earth, along with Egypt, Babylon, India, and China. It's a pretty rare set of cultures, right? Just a handful in the world that have had that continuously urban civilizations. And we're going to see the evidence of some of the urban artifacts in today's slides on Mexico, and we may get to Peru. And if we do, I'll go ahead and say with Peru, you're looking at a country of, one of my best friends is actually was living down there for a while. He hasn't been a while, but it's around 45 million. That's a pretty good sized country in population and area. And that's where the Incan Empire was headquartered. As you probably all know, the Mayans were located throughout Central America. The Aztecs were specifically located in Mexico. So let's get started with the first must-know slide. Okay, for today, and it's fascinating, these next few. I know many of you have mentioned you've traveled to or been to or even are from, or your family background is from Mexico. Okay, so this is the first must know. This is a very important slide. I can tell you I won't cut it from the study list. I'm not saying it has a very, very high probability of being on the exam. There's sort of 3 categories: slides that might or might not get cut, slides that I definitely won't cut, and then the top level of importance are the ones where I will tell you is a high probability of being on the exam. This is in the second level of that. It could be on the exam. Okay, so what is the title of this work of art? Okay, if you have it on your syllabus in front of you, it's The Founding of Tenochtitlan, or Tenochtitlan. I can barely pronounce that, it's multisyllabic. Of course, it's the capital, was the capital of the Aztec Empire. So founding, right, of 3 words, Tenochtitlan. It's Tenochtitlan. Titlan, Tenochtitlan, Mexico, or Mexico, as we Americans, English-speaking people say it. 1545. Well, if you know your history, this is long after the Spanish conquest. So here's the background of this. So there's a lot of history of this. So I think what I'll do is I'll tell you the overview of it, and then I'll summarize. So depending on how you're taking your notes, you wouldn't have to take everything I'm saying down. Remember, on the exams, you already know from the midterm, there's only going to be 3 slides out of the study list after we cut 40% of the total from the syllabus in the review, right? And on about the final now. The second midterm is not about memorization or facts or dates or any of that. I'll explain later, but the final is. So the final is everything. I've said this before, but I'll repeat it several times. You could cover anything after the midterm. So nothing before the midterm. You don't have to worry about things you studied, before the midterm. Okay, so this could be on the exam. And so I think it's important to know that this was after the Spanish conquest. This was created by most historians believe an indigenous artist who had been a citizen, a resident, if you want to say it that way, of Tenochtitlan, which was the Aztec capital. That's the important point about what was Tenochtitlan. It's now the exact same site is the capital of Mexico, as you know, if you've been there. It's one of my favorite cities, Mexico City, or Ciudad de Mexico, right? The capital of Mexico is built over the ruins of the Aztec capital. If you didn't know that, you should be writing this. Okay, so this shows what the city, just in a diagrammatic, kind of form, not details, but it gives some idea, you could say an indication or an overview of the layout, really, that's the right word, of Tenochtitlan. By no means is it comprehensive. So let's say, what was Tenochtitlan? What was it like? How big was it and how important was it? Really one of the most important cities in the world before the Spanish destroyed it, which would be that it was, some people feel, the largest city on earth. That it's hard to prove, but we know it had about 500,000 inhabitants. Even now, that's a major city. Of course, there are many much bigger cities in the world today, but at that point in the early 16th century, around 1500, when the Aztecs were at the height of their power and they ruled their empire from this city, Tenochtitlan, there was, most historians agree, at least 500,000 people, some say 1 million, within the city of Tenochtitlan, making it, if not the largest, one of the very largest cities on earth. Bigger than London and Paris at that time. There could have been cities in China that were bigger. So certainly the largest city in the Western Hemisphere at that time, okay? And then, as you may not know, if you don't already, you should write this, Cortez, right? Just like it sounds with a C, Cortez came and invaded. And after 3 years of warfare and back and forth, where he was repelled at first when he tried to invade the Aztec Empire and take the city, he was pushed out. But he came back with some Indian soldiers who had been conquered by the Aztecs and had a reason to want to overthrow them. Allied soldiers, however you want to say it, who were indigenous, along with his Spanish soldiers. And they took the city and destroyed it in 1522. I think I have that right. So that's, wow, that is 400 and almost, no, it's exactly 500 years ago. Exactly 500 years. So that, some people would say, is the date of the founding of Mexico City, although it didn't happen overnight, because first the Spanish destroyed as much as they could of the old city of the Aztecs. So this shows how it would have, been arranged. We're talking about, again, a schematic overview, not a detailed map. The main point of this that you really need to emphasize, there are 3 or 4 things about what this illustration shows. It's from a book, a page from a book, which was a talented artist hired by the Spanish who was Aztec, who had lived in the city, so they knew what it was like before it was destroyed, to do a history of that city and of the Aztecs for a Spanish library. I assume it was for a library, or maybe even the governor of that was then the province. By that time, it was the province by the 1540s of the Spanish Empire. So that's how this ended up being preserved in a library. I'm not sure which library it is, but it's open. You could take a look at it if you went to that library, if you had permission. It's an irreplaceable document because it's done by a person who was there at the time before the Spanish invasion. So what did the city have before the Spanish destroyed it? It had a series of canals. Some of you already know this, but if you don't, you should. And that's what these blue lines symbolize. There was an outer canal around the outer edge of the city. We'd call it city limits today, right? And then there was an inner system of canals that crossed each other, and there were multiple canals. This just hints at the fact that there were several canals that crisscrossed, you could say, or crossed over each other throughout the city. That's how they got around on boats between different neighborhoods. And in the center of the city would have been the main temples, and Montezuma was then, as some of you know, right? Montezuma was the last, or at least the second to the last, actually, Aztec emperor. There was one that briefly, a puppet that the Spanish tried to put in place after Montezuma was killed. But Montezuma, most people consider him the last of the Aztec emperors. So his palace was in the center along with the main temples. You're going to see a drawing of what the most important temple, Aztec temple, looked like in the next must-know slide. So for now, all you have to say is in the center of the city were the most important buildings, including their largest temples, Aztec religious sites, right? And of course, the palace for the emperor and all of his staff. But also, this shows the symbol of Mexico itself. And many of you already know this. On the flag of Mexico, there's an eagle landing on top of a cactus growing out of a rock. It's a fascinating image that has been for hundreds of years symbolic of the nation itself. Well, at least since they broke away from Spain more than 200 years ago, Mexico rebelled against the Spanish and became independent. So at least that far back, this image of the founding, right, of Tenochtitlan, not Mexico City per se, but in a way it's of both, because what happened was that the site was used by the Spanish to start building, and much of the stonework from the temples they destroyed was reused to build their cathedrals, and you'll see some evidence of that, and they're more modern buildings. What was then modern, right? The Spanish colonial architecture of the oldest part of Mexico City, much of those buildings is directly taken from the, well, you can say rubble or ruins, is probably a better word, ruins of the stonework that lay all over after these temples were destroyed by the Spanish conquerors, and then reused, or however you want to say that, recycled into Spanish colonial buildings, Catholic churches and so forth. So it is a symbol for, in a way, that the eagle landing on the cactus growing out of a rock is a symbol both for the country of Mexico and the current city of Mexico City. But originally it was symbolic. The Aztecs chose because they saw a vision of an eagle landing there to make their capital, Tenochtitlan. So that's pretty much the whole meaning, with one other exception here. Here are Aztec warriors who were stationed throughout the city. And this is an indication of the human sacrifice, which sacrifices they did just several times a year, not every week or even maybe every month, but several times a year on certain important religious, well, I don't know if I can call them holidays or religious events. There would be sometimes captured, usually enemy citizens, usually they were enemy soldiers captured in battle that were, conquered by the Aztecs. Many, not all, but many of them would end up becoming a subject of the human sacrifices in those temples. And that's what this skull symbolizes. And then there are other cactuses you see, of course, which are indigenous to that part of Central America. And then down here are Aztec warriors battling some of their enemies, the ones I just mentioned, and an indication of their temples. But here you do see, it's almost like a hint of what was going to happen, right? When the Spanish came, the top section of two of their temples toppling over, quite literally. But of course, they had earthquakes and other natural disasters, but primarily earthquakes, which could have done that to the temples before the Spanish. But these are Aztec warriors, and they're armed in the way Aztec warriors would have been before the Spanish came. And then these would be rival tribes or cultures that they conquered. So that's the whole meaning of this. It's fascinating. There's hardly anything left of the actual original evidence of what the city looked like, except a few things like this, drawings, and then you'll see a piece of stone, a calendar. That's a very important slide, and one that I I will tell you when I get to it, is even more important to study for the final than this. Okay, so let's do a formal analysis. Well, I'd say it's balanced, although people who look at this technically, because for whatever reason, this map maker here stopped with that section and left it open so he could write on there what this was, what this illustration was about. If you want to look at it that way, you could say it's unbalanced toward the bottom, but I don't think so. Again, it depends on where you draw the line across the middle, because you've got roughly equal, almost, very clearly actually equal numbers of objects, people or cacti or warriors down here. Roughly, I'd say it's roughly balanced top to bottom and left to right. Again, if you want to get technical, there are 4 seated warriors or soldiers on this side and only 2 here. But when you add up the other objects, you can see the point. It's roughly balanced, I think, both ways. The lines are mostly thin, except some say around, but you can almost see lines around that eagle. So, and the cactus. So you could say the objects, or even maybe that stone that cactus is growing out of, have bold lines, but and maybe the canals. Some people would say that, but the actual all the other figures, the cacti, the soldiers, those are thin. So mostly thin outlines. Is there modeling? Yes, on the 3 objects in the middle. Well, I don't know about the stone so much. It's hard to say, but certainly on the cactus, if you look closely, and on the eagle, there's some very good, realistic, simulated textures done with, of course, painted. This is a painting, painted lines that also, of course, use strong modeling to make them look sharp and realistic. Not really, I don't see modeling on the kneeling, right, or seated warriors, or these standing ones who with their swords and shields, or clubs, I should say, and shields that are engaged in battle. I don't see any other modeling besides the objects in the center. And assuming a texture is implied on all the other figures, it's very sharp and realistic on the eagle, the cactus, and the stone. It's implied on the hair and the clothing, and to some degree more directly clear simulated textures about on the 2 bottom soldiers, because you see more detail on their clothing. Is it stable or dynamic? Well, obviously the diagonal lines for the canals are dynamic. And so is the eagle and the cactus and the 3 objects in the middle of the stone. But the warriors, the seated warriors or crouching warriors, they're pretty stable. And I would say the same of the 2 down below, except for their arms with their extending with their weapons there. But otherwise, it's more stable than dynamic. Obviously, there's powerful rhythm throughout. Repeated shapes of the kneeling or crouching soldiers. I guess they're crouching or sitting, I should say. And of course, the cacti. And this pattern of various geometric detailing on the outside of which I'm not certain of if each one has a different meaning, so you don't need to know that. Just say the different decorative panels create very powerful rhythm, obviously, so all the human figures. For space, there's only overlapping. There's no diminishing size. There's no foreshortening. There's no, obviously, atmospheric or scientific perspective. No register line, so it's just overlapping, and that's limited to the clothing overlapping the human figures, the eagle overlapping the cactus. The largest mass, that's a close call. It's if you count the border, the outer border, you have to say that's the largest. Or if you think of each of the square panels as separate masses, then I guess you could say the canals or the eagle. It's up to you to decide. Certainly of all the objects in the middle, the eagle's the largest. And then it's a close call between the eagle and maybe these warriors. I mean, the second largest mass. These 2 warriors down here, or maybe the cactus would be the second largest. And then the seated warriors. Okay, and proportions. Well, that's a little less obvious, but I would say it's distorted because surely they weren't fighting people that were half the height of the Aztec warriors. I mean, when they went into battle. So there's clearly an altered proportion to the figures at the bottom, where the Aztecs are shown larger proportionately. I'm sorry, scale. I will rephrase that. I apologize. The scale between the 2 sets of warriors at the bottom is distorted or altered, in that the scale of the Aztec warriors with their shields is almost twice the size of their enemy soldiers that they're battling or defeating. So that's not normal, obviously. Whereas it's pretty much just normal. Both the proportions within each figure are all accurate, including on the eagle's body there. That's pretty accurate renditions of the eagle's wings and talons. So there isn't any altered or distorted proportions within each figure, but there are altered scales on the bottom figures. Okay, I think we've covered everything here. All right, let's move on to the next must-know. This is an interesting image to explain several things about Aztec civilization, their urban civilization. It's the second one on our list, the second must-know. 2 words, Templo Mayor, and that's Templo, and then the second word is Mayor. That means major or main temple. Location is Mexico City, and the date is, remember, a little c you can ignore if it's on the exam of this slide. You could just write 1500. We don't have the exact year because this is a drawing of what this temple would have looked like, but I've been to this temple. That will surprise a few of you. I mean, what? How could you? It was destroyed. Well, that's what everyone thought. For hundreds of years, it was gone, from sight or from any human knowledge. The Spanish did try to destroy it, but for some reason, they didn't completely destroy it. It was buried under rubble for centuries below the streets of Mexico City. And it was found about, in the late 70s, you can say less, sometime in the late 20th century, the late 1900s. It was in the 70s when they were digging for the subway lines. I believe that's what it was, Mexico City subway system. And some of their workers, on that project found everything from blocks of stone to carved snakes and other sacred Aztec gods and animals, and human remains, all of the above. And then they found, in other words, what's happened is that they've excavated around the site roughly half of the temple. The upper half has been found, or you could say, excavate. You don't want to say restored. They haven't completely rebuilt it, but they've repaired parts of it. It's open to the public, and there's a museum right near it where you can go and see some of the other artifacts, including human skulls and things from their sacrifices, as well as weapons and sculpture and so forth. It's fascinating. So where is this? It's in the heart of Mexico City. Was the largest temple of the Aztec Empire in the capital city, of course, which was Tenochtitlan. And it's where the largest human sacrifices were conducted during certain religious ceremonies. It's right behind the cathedral. The oldest Christian church in this hemisphere is, well, let me think. Yeah, it is. It's older than, even though Cuba had been around as a Spanish colony for decades before Mexico was invaded. In fact, Cortez came from Cuba to invade Mexico, but there's no churches, I've been all over Cuba, that are as old. So the oldest Christian church is right. You can literally, they're almost kitty corner to each other. It's behind the Catholic cathedral, the main cathedral of Mexico City, one of the largest churches in this hemisphere. It's huge and it's fascinating. But that was built with stone, some of them, not all of them, but some of the stones from ruins, and perhaps including this temple. But enough of the temple survived and was rediscovered in the late 1900s, you can just say it that way, to be now a historic site open to the public, where you can go see what it might have looked like. It's the upper half, minus most of what these 2 sacrifice rooms would have been, where the priests would have conducted the sacrifices. You get a hint of that from the blood that you can see here in this illustration, where, yes, the hearts of those people that were deemed to be necessary, as in their religion, they were thinking they had to satisfy some of their gods to guarantee good harvest and no starvation, or after all, they had plagues, diseases, no natural disasters, so that they would have healthy population. They believed they had to offer human sacrifice of their enemies to their gods every so often, and that's what was conducted here in this temple. Not every day or every week, but often enough that thousands of skulls were found when this was rediscovered by people digging for that subway line, and some of those are in the museum. which is just behind this building. It's open to the public. So you can walk up about the upper half. The stairs are a little less steep than this, as I recall. Well, no, actually, they probably are, but it's not that. Yeah, there are some of these temples where you're not allowed to climb up to the top. At least that's what I've been told by people in other parts of Central America. Yucatan Peninsula, I've only ever been there briefly, and there was a hurricane coming, so I wasn't able to go see the sites of the Mayans, but I have seen many Aztec sites in central Mexico, including this one. Okay, so these two rooms were the prayer rooms and the priests' preparation rooms for human sacrifice. That's what they were. Those two rooms were actually the true temples, were those buildings. Interesting looking, aren't they? Fascinating, in fact, the geometry of them and the colors and the patterns. But inside those rooms, the priests either prepared for most ceremonies were not bloodletting, but they had many each year. And yes, it was in the thousands every year of human prisoners were sacrificed, adults. I'm pretty sure mostly men, but in any case, people captured in battle several times a year. And so the preparations for either the non-human sacrifice or all religious rituals, including human sacrifice, were done here. The priests would also get ready for their, prayers to audiences. Of course, we're talking about thousands of people down below on the streets of that was, of course, the capital then, right? This actually is kind of misleading. It makes it look like there was only maybe a few dozen people each time they had a religious ceremony. No, it would have been thousands. There's a movie called Apocalypto. You may have heard of it. It's actually pretty accurate, according to, I have friends who teach at universities in Mexico who are from Mexico, who said that they were consulted or people in their history departments were consulted for the research for that movie. So it does indicate the conflict between different cultures within Mexico before, and then it does end with a pretty sad moment for the native cultures. Of course, the arrival of the first Spanish ships off the coast of Mexico. Apocalypto. It's an interesting movie, and it's pretty accurate. It recreates the urban setting of what these places were like, but it's not set in Tenochtitlan. It's a different city within what would now be Mexico. One of the Aztecs' many cities. They had a lot of cities. It wasn't just this city, but most of them were not that large. They were in the tens of thousands. Okay, that's most of the meaning, except that, is this a pyramid? Yes. So I guess it would end with that. It's a pretty important fact. It's a stepped, with an ED, right? Stepped, not step, but Stepped, stepped pyramid, which means that it's set back each level. And that's the oldest kind of pyramid in the world. There are stepped pyramids in Egypt before the flat-sided pyramids of the Great Pyramids of Giza that you've all seen pictures of right outside of Cairo, which I got to go inside of. Those are flat-sided pyramids. The Egyptians invented that type of pyramid. But before that, the Egyptians, Babylonians, Chinese, and the indigenous cultures in Central America all had step pyramids that go back thousands of years. So that's what this is, a classic example of a Aztec style step pyramid with two temples on top. Sometimes they call the whole thing a temple because in a way it is. It's all for religious purposes. Okay, let's do a formal analysis. Is it balanced? Oh, yeah. Except because this is higher by probably a good 10 feet or so. It'd be hard to say, to deny rather, that it's slightly unbalanced toward the right if you take it. But the structure, the actual pyramid, the step pyramid, that's completely symmetrical, of course, as all pyramids are, left to right, and unbalanced or weighted, of course, toward the bottom. The rhythm is obvious with the setbacks or steps and the stairs, right? And then the two temples, they may be slightly different heights, but they are similar in shape, aren't they? And the openings are the same size. And then these two platforms down here where there would have been other religious functions as well. So it's got plenty of rhythm, of course, throughout the whole building. Is it stable? Well, like most pyramids, it's both stable and dynamic. It's stable on each individual level, right? The top of each level. And on the platform or plateau, but I call it's a platform at the top where the sacrifices and the other religious rituals were conducted. That's obviously stable, but the stairs and the slope of the building, and then the tapered walls on the two temples on the top, that's obviously dynamic. So it's both. There's no technique for modeling. It's just the shadows from the sun. The textures are the real rough texture of stone. Don't think there's any other textures that you can see there. So you have the real rough texture of stone, and I don't believe there, I know there was no glass. I thought about that, and I checked in with the curator of that museum that's behind this. He said, no, they didn't have glass at this point. But in any case, there could have been other materials, but all you can see in this is the stonework. So just real rough textures of stone. The color, mostly cool, kind of a light gray color, except for the red paint on the temple to the right, the tallest of the two temples at the top. Obviously, that's mostly warm. Everything else is cool. The lines, there is carved line, but you can't see it here. That would be on the snake heads. You know what? It's not that important, but then again, it is. Now I realize these are the two snake heads that I saw, and I have them in my own slides, but I don't think I have those. No, I don't have them digitalized. In my in-person classes, I have been showing those of my visit to this site and other parts of Mexico City. It's a fascinating city, full of incredible architectural history and paintings by Frida Kahlo and Diego Rivera. It's an amazing city. But anyway, I remember now it was the bottom half that they've excavated. The top half was destroyed by the Spanish, which would make sense. So the part that was buried was roughly the bottom half, not the top half. Otherwise, they'd still be digging and finding more sections below. So they've found all that there is now, and they may decide to restore or add to what's there, but they haven't yet. So it's just the bottom half that has been excavated or rediscovered, found recently. Okay, and so these are carved lines, but you can't see them from here. These snakes here, that's two of their most sacred animals, or the gods were actually snake gods. So all you can say is in this photo, you cannot see carved line. All you can see is visual line along the stairs and at the edges, of course, where the sun creates modeling. For space, it's real space. It's solid, it's not hollow. And it's about 200 feet tall. And the tops of these are about another 30 to 40 feet. So it's about the tallest part of this, of the two right temples on the top, the one on the right, makes it, the total height is nearly 240. It might be close to 230, but just say over 200 feet total. And the pyramid itself proper is nearly or about 200 feet up to the base. So the total, including this, is 230 or 40 feet total. And so that's all real space. There's no techniques for space, and it's solid. So is it a single mass? Not really. The main, obviously largest mass would be the pyramid, and then the taller of the two temples at the top with the red decorations. And then the third largest is obviously the one on the left. There is no distortion here or abnormal proportion or scale, right? Because there isn't anything in a building. Usually there isn't any kind of distorted proportions or scales. There can be if there's a part of a building that's unusually, uncharacteristically exaggerated by the architect, but I don't see that here. So the proportions are just normal for what the purpose of the building is. Okay, and of course the rhythm, I think I mentioned, is right, the stairs and thing. And then, yeah, I think we covered everything here. All right. This is, I'm going to say, of all the slides we're covering today's lecture, this Monday lecture is the most important slide. It's got the highest probability of being on the final. I won't say it will be for sure, of course. I would never do that because that's giving away too much information, but take extra thorough notes on this. It's a very important work of art as well as an important historical document. The title is Calendar Stone. Calendar Stone. The location is in the country of Mexico. And again, we don't have the exact date, but about 1500. This is in a museum in Mexico City. I cannot emphasize too much how I recommend, if you go to Mexico City, don't just go to the obvious places where most tourists go. If you don't know the city, the museums, the main cathedral, that ruined Aztec temple, I would make a beeline for, or before you leave, spend a whole day at the Museo de Nacional Antropológico. I can never say it. The National Anthropology Museum is one of the best in the world. It's fascinating. It's so well designed. It was designed by a 105-year-old architect from Germany, of all things, who was hired by the government of Mexico because he had the best plan. It recreates every period of that 5,000 years of urban civilization that Mexico has in different wings. And in each wing, there's something just mind blowing to look at. So this is this is how you summarize this. The first thing is it is a giant round piece of stone over 12 feet in diameter, 12 feet over, I think it's just over 12 feet or about 12 feet in diameter, that was rediscovered along with, I think about the same time, in other words, not at the same place, but around that same time as the Templo Mayor's ruins were found. Again, for an excavation, in this case, I think it was for, I don't know, some other project, shopping center or something. So just say workers in the late 1900s, I believe it was the late 1970s, discovered this stone, it intact, buried for centuries. It had been created just before the Spanish invasion by the rulers of the Aztec Empire as a symbol of their cycles of history. That's the way to look at it. And it even, many historians believe, shows the evidence that the Aztecs predicted their own fall at the hands of strangers from a different part of the world. That's a pretty spooky thought, but there is evidence on this piece, and I don't have enough detailed knowledge. I'm not an expert in archaeology of Mexico per se, but I can tell you I've read enough about it to say that there are many, just say many historians, actually majority that I've read, believe that this shows the evidence that the Aztecs knew that there was an invasion of some other culture that would destroy theirs about the time that it happened, around 1520, which would be about 20 years after this stone was created. So this stone was created at the high point, in other words, to document the previous history of the Aztec Empire around 1500, and within a generation, right, just a little over 20 years there. So as we know already, the civilization fell to the Spanish, and that event, that tragedy was predicted by their own historians who, created this stone. Well, they didn't create it, they hired, stonemasons. It's an incredible work of art. It's on display in that museum, and it's so big that it has almost like a huge separate section of the museum that you can walk around and look down at it. It's down just below eye level. It's fascinating, and it's intact. So it displays many of the gods, of their most important gods. The one in the middle is a god of destruction. And, I'd have trouble pronouncing, let alone asking you to spell the names of each of their gods. So I'm not going to ask you to do that unless you choose to on the exam, for instance. But their main or most powerful god of destruction is the one in the middle. And I think you can see the expression and the grimace, on his, his mouth and his protruding tongue indicate that it is a god of vengeance, a god of destruction. And then these are serpent gods that are showing, of course, not showing, but are displaying, you could say, or extending, right, their tails towards the viewers here. And they are also important, symbolic of important Aztec gods. They worship several kinds of animals, eagles, snakes, and other kinds of actual real species that are common in Mexico were considered, some of them, actual gods or sacred creatures, as the Egyptians all we know did with, as if ancient Egyptian, something about their culture, they worship cats, right, and vultures and cobras, and so almost every culture has had their own kind of worship, if you could say, or admiration. In the case of the Aztecs, it was actual worship of various animal species that they considered sacred. And there are at least two here of the snake. Snake-like. They weren't exactly snakes. They had snake-like bodies that were gods, again, of destructive forces in nature. And then these are symbolic of the positive forces. These are supposed to be symbolizing the rays of the sun. Well, the whole thing in the middle, of course, would have had the implied, symbol of the sun itself, as powerful and important as that is, of course, in a culture that has so directly impacted by blazing sun. It's one of the hottest countries I've ever been to, Mexico. The whole area, of course, around Mexico City, it's a plateau, and there's not a lot of forest land there, and so the sun is very powerful effect on their culture. And so this would be a positive symbol of the forces of life, the forces of construction, you could say, or creation. Sorry, that's a better word. Creation or life that the sun symbolizes, of course, because it gives life to all living things on earth. And then here's a jaguar head. It's another one of their gods, symbolic of. And then here's another snake-like god there. And then we have the actual outer sections, but mostly it's the very outer rim, you have to see the rim. It has different details that symbolize events, important events in the history of the Aztec people, which, by the way, they were just over 200 years old by the time the Spanish conquered them. Their empire, that doesn't mean the people themselves sprang out of, the thin air 200 years before Cortez came, but their empire was about 200 years old. That's a pretty good length of time for them to have ruled almost all of what's now Mexico and a good part of the northern sections of Central America. And so this indicates the various cycles of the history of their people and their culture. And at least at some point, somewhere along this outer rim, there's a hint of destruction coming. And I don't know which panel, if any, it could be this one. You have to know which one would predict that there will be a cataclysmic event that will lead to the downfall of that culture, of their own people. It's kind of a almost spooky thing when you think about that they were predicting something that then when it happened, they felt it was just fulfilling a prophecy that their own gods willed upon them. However, of course, they didn't sit back and just say, okay, come in. They fought fiercely against the Spanish and kicked them back all the way to the coast the first time they tried to invade, as you probably know. Okay, that's plenty on the meaning of this. Let's do a formal analysis. Is it balanced? Oh yeah. Completely symmetrical, and all the imagery of the rays of the sun, the different panels with different gods, heads of different gods here in the middle, and the geometric patterns around the outer edge, and then the symbolic rim with the different events. It's roughly balanced in every direction, top to bottom, left to right. Is there any technique for space? Well, it is too. There's the real space, not technique. I mean, there are two aspects. One is the real space. It's about a 12-foot in diameter piece of stone, which then within each of the images there is overlapping on some objects, of course. You could say all the objects overlap the actual base, the stone they carved on, if you want to look at it that way. But certainly these snake gods down here, serpent gods, and then all these panels here, these four different heads of different gods, they overlap everything behind them. It's the only technique for space. And then the modeling, of course, is the shadows, in this case from the museum lighting, but originally would have been from the sun. It is so dynamic, I see almost nothing stable about it unless you want to count the lines that divide some of these panels. You could say that those are stable. But look at everything. It's diagonal lines, the triangle almost shape of these rays of the sun, and the circular patterns, even the square, of the outer border of these four panels, the objects inside them are dynamic. So it's almost entirely dynamic. All of the detail is done with carved line. And it, I guess you could say, has some texture on the scaly skin of the serpent gods. And I would say on the jaguar's head. And maybe you could even say on the the main god of destruction in the middle, Quetzalcoatl, I think his name is, but you have to write that anyway. And so that's a texture in, even if it's an imaginary somewhat, because the only actual creature you can see here that is related to a real biological one would be the jaguar's head. But that's texture done with carved line. And then is there any distorted proportions? You could say that with the serpent gods and their tails, being dominant over the, whereas but how can you compare that to whatever the other? They're larger than the head of the jaguar that's inside the one square border or panel. But I don't know if you can call it distorted. It's to me, it's not clear that there is. So I would say it's not. Obviously, there isn't any obvious example of either distorted proportion or scale here. And the rhythm is obvious. The repeated shapes of the sun, the rays of the sun, the animals' heads, the gods' heads in these four panels, and these two serpents, and all the carved events summarized on the outer ridge. Lots of rhythm. It's a single mass. Yeah, or you could break it down. I'll leave that to you. If you decide to do that, which are larger, the serpent gods at the bottom or the god of destruction in the middle? Pretty close. Okay, balance rhythm. Oh, and the color is a cool gray color, clearly. Okay, let's move on. And this is a really important slide. I'm not cutting it from the study list for sure. This is Machu Picchu. Machu is M-A-C-H-U, two words, Picchu, P-I-C-C-H-U. Machu Picchu, Peru, the country, Peru is P-E-R-U. 1400s. I didn't even put the little C here because we just know it was built over that century, which was during the late Middle Ages in Europe. The Inca Empire was even larger than the Aztec Empire. Some of you know this. It ran the entire, almost, not quite, but almost the whole length of South America, the continent. It ran from, almost the route where Bolivia is, Ecuador, right, which are the northern part of South America, if you look at a map, all the way through Peru, which was their heartland of their empire, what's now the country Peru, and all the way down through into Chile, or Chile. That's a pretty large empire. Now, it was long and narrow, but still, they had tens of millions of people under their rule. Well, some historians say 10 million, others say 20, a few even say 30. So just say it was somewhere in the low tens of millions of people under their empire, ruled from two different capitals. And we don't have to concern ourselves with the one we're not looking at, but this is one of those two capitals. And it was the most sacred site to the Incas, where their emperor would spend several months a year, depending on the weather, because this is up in the mountains. So in the hot summer months, the emperor and his entourage, right, all of his staff and his bodyguards and his extended family and also the people that actually lived in this town, because it wasn't just a temporary summer camp or anything like that. It was a permanent resident for thousands of citizens. They would, of course, have ceremonies when the emperor was staying there, various important religious ceremonies in honor of the emperor or even of just their own religious holidays. It's at over 10,000 feet. That makes it twice as high as one of the highest American cities, and I don't mean in the sense of what people smoke, is Denver. You may know Denver's a mile high. That's its nickname. Some of you know this. I have friends from Denver. But this is more than twice that. Right? It's more than 2 miles, in other words, above sea level. Some people have trouble breathing if they've not gotten used to that altitude. And certainly if you are going to go there, you should prepare and follow the instructions that the government of Peru has for visitors. Because unless you've lived in mountain climates like this, or trained for athletic contests at high altitude, you can easily get altitude sickness. It happened to a couple of people I know that went there that weren't prepared. Even if not at the beginning, just showing up there, if you climb up and down on these ruins, which I don't know if you can even do that anymore, but a few years ago, several years ago, you could go walking all over this. That exertion at that altitude can give you a very serious illness called altitude sickness. So be aware of that. But not with the Incas. They were used to it, of course, and they had developed their lung power so that it didn't harm them, either the residents or the emperor and his visiting entourage. And so these are houses, temples, and government buildings, which would have been, in the heart of this city because it extended down the hillside. And one of my friends who just came over to my house, who was the one that I said lived in Peru, he actually climbed to the top of this. It's like, that's risky. He didn't have mountain climbing equipment either. I don't think they'd let you do that now. But that would have been a ceremonial site for Incan priests, probably to greet the sunrise or sunset. It's in the Andes. If you didn't know, those are the tallest mountains in this hemisphere. Andes, Andes. The mountains are much higher than the Rockies, and even higher than I think almost all of the Sierra. Maybe the mountains in Alaska are equally tall. We're talking about over 20,000 feet. Some of the tallest mountains in the world run along the spine, the western edge of South America. That's where the Incan Empire was. Plus, you may not know this if you don't write it, they had the best communication system of any civilization in the world at that time. They could get messages from one end of the empire to the other in a 2, 3, or 4 days, depending on how far off the roads. Because why? They had this great road system, paved roads, mostly stone, not paved like, tar and, American roads would be, but, well-built road system that was as good, at least, as the Roman road system. And they had runners who would relay a message, run as far as they could and as fast until they nearly collapsed and hand that message to someone at the next station. So by using runners and relays and having a really, really well-maintained, well-built, well-maintained road system that ran the length of the entire empire, they could communicate from one of the end of their empire to the other in a few days. In Europe, it took weeks for letters just to get across parts of the Europe, let alone across the Atlantic. It's pretty impressive. It was a very highly developed civilization. Now, their cities didn't have as many people as Tenochtitlan did, but not this city would have been in the low thousands, probably 10,000 people, maybe 5 to 10,000. But their main cities, their bigger cities down below where the populations were larger, most historians estimate 100 to 200,000. So those are pretty good sized cities for that period of history. And then the Spanish conquered it, and of course, destroyed that civilization in the mid 1500s, about 20 years or so after they invaded Mexico. So these are the ruins of what the Spanish didn't actually destroy completely. The roofs are missing, as you can see. Let's get a close up here off of many of these houses. And some of them are being restored, so I've been told more recently by the Peruvian government. So that's pretty much the whole, and also the farms that provided the food for these people are these terraced farms that you can see in Asia. I've seen them in Vietnam and China. These steep hillside farms, that's some of the hardest terrain in the world to farm, to cultivate, but they produce some really very prodigious amounts of food, some of which was even exported down below to cities down in the, lower altitudes. But more than enough for the residents of the city and the emperor and his visiting, I keep saying, entourage, right, when he came to stay. So they never had to worry about starving. They were up in the mountains like this, maybe they had trouble getting food or they had to import it. Now they were able to grow most of the food they needed, and they also had cattle. Formal analysis. This is the central plaza. To me, it's roughly balanced, if you look at it that way, between the two halves of the city, the left and okay, and then we have the rhythm, of course, of the individual houses, the terraced gardens and farmland, and the walls, of course, are really amazing. Handmade stone walls, which are so finely fitted that with no maintenance for over 500 years have been left out in the open air, or about that. They're still standing. They don't have mortar in them. They're just stone fitted to each other stones. It's called fitted stone. So that, course, is texture of real rough stone. That's the only texture here. They would have had clay tile probably on the roofs or grass thatch roofs. We don't know. They're not there anymore. So we just see the texture of rough real stone. It's a cool gray color, right? And then we have the rhythm of each individual rectangular or square structure, a house, a temple, a granary. They stored over the winter. Of course, they would have stored their produce. And then we have, it's stable or dynamic? Well, the sides of the mountains and the terrace sections of the town, of the terraced farm land is obviously dynamic, but each individual building is stable with the exception of some, not most, but some of the houses would have had these peaked gables like you often see in medieval European housing, but most of them were rectangular or square with flat roofs. As far as we know, in any case. And then we have the modeling is just the shadows from the sun. And for space, I said it's a city of let's say several thousands, 5 to 10,000 population. So there were hundreds of buildings of varying sizes that could house several thousand. That's not a few, that's several thousand people. That's real space. There's no techniques for space here. Okay, and there's no distortion of proportion or scale between these structures, because again, architecture doesn't usually have that aspect, and we don't see any sculpture here. There might have been, there probably is a little left. Can I ask, has anybody here been to Peru? Anybody in this Zoom class today? Okay. Yeah, I always ask if people have, and once every year or so, I'll get someone who says they have and might be able to comment. But as far as I know, this is still a very popular tourist site. I think it was temporarily closed during the height of the pandemic, but it's open again. I've talked to people who have been there within the last year and a half. But I don't think you can climb up and down and all around it like you used to be able to. So in that sense, it's less accessible, but it's, you'd have to take a bus. You wouldn't be able to walk from the nearest city in Peru up these mountains, even if you were really, your lungs were acclimatized, it wouldn't be healthy. So you have to take some kind of a motor transportation to get up to the, there's a parking area, of course, and then guides. You can't just wander around by yourself. You can walk through it. Someday that's on my bucket list. I'd like to do that. Let's see. The color, I said cool gray, right? And line is visual line here. There's you don't see the carved line. There probably is. You can say on each stone if you want to, because obviously there are stones in the wall. So you could say that. But it's hard to see that much detail. So just the edges of the buildings where the sun creates the modeling. And for the largest mass, it would be the closest, these are probably almost certainly temples or large public buildings nearest to the edge of the photo here. Those would be the largest masses, and the smaller masses would be, of course, second largest masses, maybe some of these group housing is almost certainly what these were. And then the individual houses, I assume those were for high-ranking priests, perhaps, would be probably the third largest masses, at least what we see in this photo. Now, I was gonna do one more slide of Latin American or South American culture, but let's save that for tomorrow. That will be the llama from Bolivia, and then we'll see North American slides of North American indigenous art. That should be interesting, including some from the Bay Area. The last slide, the Miwok Village, you can go see it. That's an extra credit option, easy 10 points, just north of Novato. I'll tell you all about that. I wrote a piece about it for Marin Magazine last year. Got a lot of response from people who read that article. And I defer to all the experts on indigenous history and culture that have already formed a museum. If you don't know about this, it's there's another 10-point option. So you could do both in one day, there'd be 20 points. The Museum of the American Indian in Novato is fascinating. It's not very large. You can see it all in a couple of hours or less, but it's well worth a visit. And I'll tell you more about that when we do the slides of North American indigenous art on Wednesday, as well as where you can go to see a recreated Miwok village. And that'll be our last must-know slide, the ones that I took when I went there to write that article. Okay, we've covered a lot, and I think we're in good shape because we're right where we should be. We're not. Questions? I'm going to stop the share. As always, I stick around to see if anybody has any important question or anything relating to what we just covered, or extra credit, or upcoming. Remember, you don't have another written assignment for another almost a month, 4 weeks, yeah, until November 9th, when the second midterm's due, and you'll have plenty of time to prepare for that one. And that one will be very different than the first midterm. It'll be an essay. I'll just give you this much information. It'll be an essay format with no bibliography and no endnotes or footnotes required, and no memorization of dates or anything. Well, of course, you have the syllabus anyway in front of you, as you did during the midterm. Okay, so we've covered everything that we needed to for today. I look forward to showing you some of the interesting sites that are closer to home, we'll say it that way, including some local Bay Area ones. I have more than one slide of the Miwok Village. I think you'll find that very interesting, and something, again, to give you an option and an extra way of getting extra credit of going and taking 4 photos yourself, or going to that Museum of the American Indian. And I'll describe how to find those 2 sites in our Zoom lecture on Wednesday. Okay, anybody have any questions? Okay, the live transcription has been enabled. I know it's been doing, whatever it's doing. I hope it has, because I don't control that at this point. Since about 4 weeks ago, I didn't know. After the first few times I saw it at the script at the bottom of the screen, but I haven't since about the third or fourth week that was doing. So I hope that's still helpful. But remember, this is all going to be posted by Friday. Usually I do it even sooner than Friday, often by Thursday evening on YouTube under my channel, this and the lecture on Wednesday. So if you signed in late or had to log out early, you can always catch up, or just, of course, for the study purposes for the final. Obviously, you'll want to do that probably. Remember that the meaning of each slide on the midterm, and then again for the final, which will be the same format as the first midterm, it can all be taken for full points from just the lecture notes, instead of having to go back and forth with the book. But the book complements or supplements what I, of course, say, and it gives you context and background that you all should read before each lecture. Of course, that's your only assignment between now and the second midterm for the next 4 weeks. Okay, any questions from anybody? I think we're good, right?
Emily,
Yes. Oh,
hi, this is Tanya. I'm just
yeah,
trying
hi.
to ask Emily if she would call me.
Okay.
Thank you.
Sure. Of course, that's part of what we're here for, to communicate back and forth between students, as well as from me to all of you. All right. So if anybody I mentioned is in the category of, for some unknown reason, having submitted or thinking they did submit their midterm and I didn't get it, and you didn't get a grade, that means that you need to verify that with your own email evidence. It shouldn't be hard to do. If you actually send it in and you happen to send to the wrong email address, it'll be obvious if you send it before the deadline. I can't accept it if it was days later. That's not fair to the students that took the test and finished it and sent it in within the time frame required. But the papers are still an option for anyone who didn't finish. Hopefully, I know most of you have done your papers, but there's a few I still don't have. And I put that in the emails when I forwarded the grades to those people who had not yet submitted, or I hadn't yet received a paper. I give them a heads up as a little helpful hint, a reminder. Okay. All right. Any other questions? Sure.
I saw that disc that you did the slide of. I saw that disc.
Oh, yeah.
I think I was in high school. It's just fascinating.
It is, isn't it?
And how they predicted, what was going to happen.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's interesting to see the fine craftsmanship, of the pieces. Tell them that
they were quite sophisticated. They had a government system.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah,
they weren't stupid.
They were the most I meant to say this, that Tenochtitlan had about the most highly sanitary city of, well, any big city in the world, but certainly a city of that size. Ancient Rome was a mixture. There were parts of Rome that were very sanitary, but there were parts of it that weren't during the height of the Roman Empire. But as far as all the evidence I've ever read, Tenochtitlan, the public services were at the top level of any city.
They were quite sophisticated, I think.
Yeah. Okay, I'm going to have to sign off. We've got a gardener showing up, and he's not supposed to do that before now. You won't be able to hear a word I say. Okay, I'll see you guys on Wednesday. All right, thanks.
Bye.
Bye.